Welcome to the Geek Homeworld. I am your host, SavageTechman. We talk sci-fi, TV, movies, superheroes, and all from a geek perspective. You can find us on Blogger, Google+, Twitter, Facebook. We're everywhere. Join the Geek Homeworld. Welcome to another exciting episode of the Geek Homeworld podcast.
Woohoo!
Joining me is Cheryl. This episode is the first of a few episodes covering the film histories of the main characters to one of the most anticipated movies of 2016, Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice.
Finally.
On this episode, we will focus on one of my all-time, and hopefully yours, favorite superheroes, Superman.
Thought you were going to say Aquaman.
No. No Green Lantern yet. So without further ado, let's dive in, as Aquaman might say, into our episode here. And let's talk about Superman's history. The first Superman films appeared about 75 years ago in 1941 with a series of animated shorts. Most people remember George Reeves as Superman. I certainly do. Mm-hmm. He played the Man of Steel in films and on television for 6 years. However, he actually was not the first Superman on film. That honor goes to the old vaudeville and Broadway actor Kirk Allen, who appeared in two film serials, the 15-episode Superman in 1948 and Atom Man vs. Superman in 1950. He reappeared in 1978's Superman the Movie as General Sam Lane, who, of course, is Lois Lane's father.
I like when they do that and bring the people back to play other roles.
That's been done in a few of the corresponding movies
see it
and
again,
all.
Yeah.
Definitely. Superman originally could not fly. He leaps tall buildings in a single bound. And when they started the films, it was easier to show him flying than leaping. So that's how it came to be, where Superman got the ability to fly.
They couldn't actually show him jumping over a building, I guess.
I suppose not. No CGI back then.
Yeah.
They could lay him down or hang him on wires or use fans to blow the cape to show motion, like flying. But in those early serials, they filmed all of Kirk's flying scenes on wires, but they had to do a different kind of method when they realized that you could clearly see the wires.
Not good.
Their solution was to show Kirk jump up and then use rotoscoping, an early technique, which is kind of like early, very, very early CGI. The illustrators would trace over the film as it projected onto a frosted glass screen. In this case, they turned the live-action character into an animated flying figure.
I really want to see that, you know.
I have. It's quite interesting.
I have a picture in my mind, but I can't really imagine it. You know, at that time, when they started the film, Superman was already a hugely popular radio program, and during World War II, he had battled Japanese bad guys. And then after the war, actually, they did this whole thing where he was fighting against the KKK, although they never said KKK on the show. And so people couldn't even imagine, maybe because of the leaping tall buildings, they couldn't imagine that you could even put Superman on film because, you have to remember that back in those days, you pretty much had to film everything just as it would appear. Like there weren't a lot of special effects. They were really very limited. Any. Yeah, but they did, they were good at sound effects because they had to do that on the radio. So they kind of had perfected that. And so, in fact, when they asked Kirk Allen if he would play Superman, he thought they were joking. He didn't think they were serious.
So he can't do that.
He just really didn't think it could be done. But they did do it, and they started off with the first serials of providing the early biography of Superman about his departure from Krypton and how he became Clark Kent and then got a job at the newspaper working with Lois Lane and
Daily Planet.
But interesting, his first nemesis there was actually Spider Lady, and we we don't see her ever again, I guess, beyond that.
I hope I never see Spider Lady.
Yeah, as afraid as you are of spiders.
Yes.
I mean, Lex Luthor didn't show up until the second set of serials, which was Adam Man versus Superman, like you said. And interestingly, both Kirk and his successor, George Reeves, were 37 years old when they started playing Superman on film, which is virtually senior citizens compared to Christopher Reeve and Henry Cavill, who were both in their 20s when they started filming. Henry Cavill is now in his early 30s, I think. But as with his successor, George Reeves, Kirk Allen also had trouble getting other work after playing Superman. And his autobiography, he even called it a job for Superman.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of actors can get typecast in movies. But a decade after those first serials, they cast George Reeves for the feature film Superman and the Mole Men.
Wow.
And that was kind of a test to determine whether they could successfully launch a series, Adventures of Superman, starring George Reeves. And they did. It was a smash hit. The show aired for 6 seasons from 1952 to 1958. The first 2 seasons were shot in black and white, and the last 4 were actually shot in color, which is a pretty amazing decision since they continued to air the show in monochrome. So TV viewers who didn't get to see it in color until the show started airing in syndication in the mid-60s.
It makes you wonder how they made that decision. Let's shoot it in color, even though we're not going to show it in color.
Yeah.
Really weird.
It's very interesting. For those of you that want to take a look at the original series, it is still airing today in the United States and on MeTV.
The cast in that first show were really tied into contracts that, because of the shooting schedule, prevented them from being able to do many other productions or movies. George Reeves did manage to get a couple of other outside roles during the early filming, but once the show started airing, he began to suffer, like you said, from typecasting, and producers and the public just could only imagine him as Superman and Clark Kent. And, you know, today it's almost unimaginable because we have actors who cross very easily from genre to genre and take on successful on-off projects with ease. Just look at Zoe Saldana. You know, Zoe Saldana, I talked about her in our Latino episode, and she's had major roles in the Star Trek, Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxies, and the Avatar franchises, but still played other roles like the upcoming biopic about jazz singer Nina Simone.
Right.
And just the other day, we saw a trailer for another biopic about country singer Hank Williams, starring none other than the Avengers' ultimate bratty sibling, my favorite villain, Loki, a.k.a. Tom Hiddleston, but he's always Loki to me.
I was like, wow, that's very different.
And last year, he was in a period costume drama, Crimson Peak. And, you know, if we look at, you know, Star Trek with Captain Kirk, Chris Pine, who in the last couple of episodes, he also took on the role now of CIA analyst Jack Ryan, which was previously played by Alec Baldwin and Harrison Ford, Ben Affleck. We're going to talk about him some more tonight. And he starred in the fairy tale musical Into the Woods and the recent action-adventure true story, The Finest Hours. And speaking of Harrison Ford, even 20 or 30 years ago, he wasn't typecast. He was simultaneously appearing as Han Solo.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
And Indiana Jones, while also, you know, showing up in the Amnesia film regarding Henry and playing the innocent man in The Fugitive and the President and Air Force One.
Get off my plane!
But back in those early days of television and film, once you were identified with an iconic character, very few other opportunities seemed to be available. And also, you know, another stigma was that television was really looked down upon at that time by screen actors.
Now it's you have actors that cross the different types from movies to TV.
Yeah, all the time. Big movie stars who are now on television.
Like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., you have Coulson.
Jennifer Lopez, who's basically done everything out there. And, dancer, singer, actor.
One thing that about George Reeves being Superman, he was immensely popular in that role. Yeah. And he was definitely so identifiable as that role, and it was very hard for him to escape.
Well, he did get, you know, he had some other opportunities though to make some money. Particularly, he got paid extra to do promotional commercials for Superman's longtime sponsor Kellogg's, which they had sponsored the radio show as well as the television program. Right. But in another sign of the times of that bygone era, Noel Neal, who played Lois Lane, didn't get to do any of the commercials, although all the other male cast members did. Apparently the powers that be were concerned that the public just might get the wrong idea if Lois and Clark were seen having breakfast together.
And Noel Neal did actually appear in Superman Returns.
Yeah, so I guess eventually she got some more work.
Yeah, so...
George himself, as you said, was very popular, and he was really careful about his reputation and the image that he portrayed as Superman. And he was one of the earliest fanboy idols for sure, and he didn't want to let the fans down, particularly since so many of them were kids. And to that end, he tried to keep his really kind of scandalous personal life out of the public eye. He was having a love affair with an older married woman. And
shocking.
So while Lois couldn't even eat cereal with him, here he is. But George, he even stopped smoking so that kids wouldn't see Superman with cigarettes. And this is in a time when cigarettes and smoking was, pretty much the norm.
Right. All the actors were doing it in TV and film.
Exactly. And like so many superstars then and now, George used his celebrity status to promote good causes, including like government saving stamps at a time when the U.S. was still recovering from World War II. And he took a leadership role in the fight against a neuromuscular birth defect called myasthenia gravis, which has impacted some really well-known people like Winnie the Pooh author A.A. Milne's son Christopher Robin and Jackie Kennedy's second husband Aristotle Onassis.
Wow.
It's not been eradicated, but today, thanks to the research and funding generated by people like George, it can be successfully managed. And recent stem cell research, which is a big thing Christopher Reeve was involved in,
True.
It's starting to show positive results from that. So he did a lot of good as Superman.
Well, after Adventures of Superman stopped filming, there were several proposed television and film projects related to it, but nothing really became of any of them.
That sounds familiar too.
Reeves also tried to work on some other projects, but also they didn't come to any kind of fruition. His finances started to suffer, and he had broken up with his longtime married mistress.
Yeah.
That's scandalous. And became engaged to another woman named Lenore Lemon. One night they were seen dining with friends at a restaurant, and they got into this big argument. And they returned home, George and her, and they went to bed. George went to bed soon after that, after midnight. Some neighbors came over, and Lenore and the friends were apparently having a loud, rowdy, drunken party downstairs. And George came downstairs and yelled at them and then went upstairs. But thereafter, there was heard a gunshot. And he was found naked, as so many celebrities are, on his bed with a gun between his feet on the floor. His death was officially ruled a suicide, although his mother and some of his friends never believed it. There are rumors that Lean and others had actually been in or near the room when the shot was fired, and that many people believed that she had murdered him.
Well, and some people actually thought it was the ex-lover, too, the dumped mistress who arranged a contract killing or something.
The case, once it was closed, it was never really reopened, never officially, but even Unsolved Mysteries, which I love to watch that even back in the day. I remember that episode when they talked about George Reeves' mysterious murder, and some believe that George would not have killed himself, and it remains a point of controversy at this point today. This tragedy contributes to speculation about an infamous curse of actors who wear the Superman suit.
Always a curse.
Including Paul Walker of Fast and Furious, who turned down the role of Superman in a possible reboot, and who later died in the fiery car accident. And of course, Christopher Reeve, who had a terrible horse accident that made him a quadriplegic and led eventually to his early death.
So Chris Reeve was the next Man of Steel after George Reeves, with an S, Chris Reeve, no S, landing the role for 1978's Superman the movie. And this project was in the work for at least 5 years before that. They brought in Mario Puzo of Godfather fame, who wrote the first script, and that was later reworked so that they can make Superman more Christ-like. And they initially wanted Steven Spielberg to direct, but this was before Steven Spielberg had really made a big name for himself. In fact, he ultimately didn't get the Superman gig because Jaws had run seriously past deadline and was way over budget. And what no one knew at that moment was that it was going to be a smash money-making blockbuster of all time. And so they dropped Spielberg for budget considerations, which seems kind of ironic to me because they contracted Marlon Brando to play Superman's Kryptonian dad Jor-El for $3.7 million, which broke down to about $300,000 a day since he only worked on the film for less than 2 weeks. Nice work if you can get it.
Exactly.
I'll take that job.
Yeah. Brando.
They also brought in veteran actor Gene Hackman to play the villain Lex Luthor, and
Yes.
For Kal-El / Clark Kent / Superman, they decided they should go with a relative newcomer, which turned out to be the classically trained Chris Reeve, who'd studied at Juilliard and Princeton and turned down a bunch of other Ivy League schools. And
good friend of Robin Williams.
yeah, oh yeah, and he'd also spent a season with the San Diego Shakespeare Festival, so another Shakespearean actor.
Mm-hmm.
But he was tall, but he was very lean, and so he had to bulk up before they could even sort of envision him as Superman. But as it turned out, he was perfect for the role. He was 6'4", so he had this really large presence, and he had that clean cut, all American kind of good looks, and that didn't hurt. And as we mentioned, he was only in his mid-20s. But he had this incredible charisma, and he intentionally chose to play the part with a gentler, more humble kind of dimension that he thought would appeal more to contemporary audiences than being like a macho law enforcer.
Which was perfect for the role.
Yeah, I mean, he really did look like everyone's image of what American superheroes should be, without flaws and patriotic, gorgeous, and kind. It really reminds me of the way Chris Evans portrays Captain America in today's films.
Definitely. The film was an unqualified success, earning both critical acclaim and financial returns. Chris even earned a BAFTA for his performance. And a good thing, too, since they filmed most of the sequel, Superman 2, while they were shooting the first film. The sequel, however, had more difficulty behind the scenes. Director Richard Donner was cut partway through the production and replaced by Richard Lester.
Well, at least it's Richard.
I know. With script changes and reshoots that caused heartburn among the cast, but pleased the producers. A special edition of Superman 2, the Richard Donner cut, was released in 2006 after Christopher Reeve's death and was very much well received by fans.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of devotion to Richard Donner and his work on the first film, too. Like George Reeves before him, though, Chris used his celebrity to promote good causes, and in his case, he worked with several child-oriented charities, including Make-A-Wish Foundation, Save the Children, and the Special Olympics. Unlike George, though, Chris didn't have to hide his private life to maintain Superman's good reputation. He maintained a long-term and uneventful, unscandalous relationship with a woman named Gay Exton, by whom he had 2 children. And when that relationship ended, there were no public fireworks, and he remained very involved with his kids. And 5 years later, he married Dana Morosini, better remembered now as Dana Reeve, and they had 1 more child, and she was also a good stepmother involved with his other children. And it was Dana who became his greatest helper and advocate following his accident. She unfortunately died of cancer just about a year and a half after his death, and just a few days, really, literally, before her 45th birthday. Their 13-year-old son, Will, was raised by family friends, and today all 3 of Chris's children, although none of them are in show business, support the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, which is dedicated to curing spinal cord injuries like the one he suffered in that horse riding accident.
Yeah, and stem cell research can definitely go a long way to hopefully
a big part of what they do, yeah.
What an inspiration Chris Reeve was, still is. But before his accident, Chris was a real-life action hero. He was a pilot, a sailor, a competitive rider. He was a political activist, particularly in areas of environmental protection and human rights, working with such high-profile organizations like Amnesty International and the Natural Defense Council. He played Superman in 2 more films, both of which earned a lot of negative criticism. Superman 3, which oddly co-starred comedian Richard Pryor.
I never understood it.
Well, the thing is, Richard Pryor was never bigger than he was at that time.
Yeah,
so that was
just
a major catch.
Yeah, weird, though. Just weird.
But it had only one saving grace, and that was Chris's dual performance as both Superman and evil Superman.
Yeah.
Or as some people call it, Bizarro. For real.
Bizarro Superman.
But after that debacle of a project, he only agreed to do a fourth film if he could have more creative control.
Not such a good idea.
And so, it was his idea to focus on one of his personal political issues, nuclear disarmament.
Like I said,
and in the
not a good
80s,
idea.
that was a big thing. The plot was kind of hokey, and then the new production studio drastically and inexplicably slashed the budget.
Why?
And as a result, the final film was a real stinker, and eventually, unusually positive, Reeve had nothing good to say about it and chose to leave his comments as the less said, the better. Now, I personally did not dislike Superman for the Quest for Peace. Yeah, he fought the solar guy in it, if you remember, and all that, but it was very topical, and it was nice to see a different
Well, I think just a
take
little
on
too
things.
topical. When you insert too much of your personal viewpoint, it can go off the rails a little bit. But during and after that period, he continued to take on other projects, including the Russian literary classic Anna Karenina and the quintessentially English film The Remains of the Day, co-starring Anthony Hopkins and Emma Thompson.
Right.
I mean, even after his accident in '96, during the dressage and cross-country horse racing competition, he accepted a few roles, performing from his wheelchair, and he even took on directorial projects.
Yeah, there was one in The Gloaming or something, I believe it was
that was
called.
the big one.
And that he directed that was very well. Initially, after suffering the spinal cord injury that left him paralyzed from the neck down and also caused excess fluid in his lungs that had to be painfully suctioned through his throat, he was despondent, even suicidal, and requesting euthanasia. His wife told him that she would love him and support him no matter what, but it was actually a good friend who helped pull him out of his depression. Ironically, it was Robin Williams who convinced him to re-engage with his life and fight to live.
Yeah, imagine.
Shortly after that, Chris's detached skull was surgically reattached to his spine, and he and Dana dedicated themselves to supporting research into spinal cord recovery. Chris spent several hours and hours upon hours in exercise and physical therapy designed to prevent his muscles from atrophying, believing that one day he could walk again. And it's incredible positivism and activism for which he is best remembered today. Nevertheless, his physical condition caused many complications, including recurrent infections that weakened his heart and led to cardiac arrest following a bad reaction to an antibiotic treatment. And when he died, he was only 52 years old. And
yeah, I mean, unbelievable the kinds of things he went to, and he just kept fighting the whole time.
Right, and ironically, later on, not too long ago, we lost his good friend Robin Williams.
Yeah, last year.
Yeah, but about a year and a half before that, however, Chris showed his great love for that role that defined his career, returning to the small screen for an episode performance as Dr. Swan on the Young Superman series Smallville, which was great. Yeah, which was wonderful to see him on screen. In fact, it was Chris's character who explains to Clark Kent who he is and tells him to use his powers for good. Following Reeves' 4 films, several different projects were proposed and then abandoned. Basically, DC and Warner Brothers spent a good decade trying to figure out what to do, while nearly every writer and director published his idea of what Superman should be. Tim Burton was even brought in to direct a script called Superman Lives, written by Kevin Smith. Several other directors turned down the opportunity at different stages of its development. These included Robert Rodriguez, Michael Bay, Brett Ratner, and Oliver Stone, among many others. Oliver Stone, I can't imagine.
Wow.
That. Kevin Smith wanted Ben Affleck to play Superman, which makes you wonder who would now be playing Batman and Batman
Maybe
versus
he'd be
Superman
fighting himself.
in the upcoming release. And ultimately, Superman superfan Nicolas Cage, who even named one of his kids Kal-El, was signed up.
I mean, why?
But that didn't work at that, and Will Smith, even, at the height of his new action film following Independence Day was being touted possibly for the role. They approached him about it, but he turned it down because he was concerned about changing Superman's ethnicity. Flash forward to Fantastic Four.
Yeah.
And everybody, when they messed with the ethnicity there, people just lost their minds.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, Will Smith saw the writing on the wall, I guess.
I don't know, but things have changed since then. The project was finally abandoned altogether, but only after spending millions and millions of dollars. Tim Burton got $5 million as part of his pay or play contract. And I wish I could get paid for not working.
Yeah. You know what? That's an even better gig than 3.2 for 2 weeks of work, you know.
I know.
So then they brought in the savior of all franchises, J.J. Abrams, to write an entirely new script and reboot the Christopher Reeve series. Sound familiar, Star Trek fans?
Definitely.
Simultaneously, in 2002, Akiva Goldsman was working on another possible Superman film, codenamed Asylum, but its real title was Batman vs. Superman. And oddly, again, Christian Bale, who was currently being courted for a new pre-Christopher Nolan Batman film, was approached to play the Superman in the Goldsman film. And I think I'm really starting to get an idea of why the DC movie productions have not been as successful as Marvel in building a cohesive universe. I mean, they're just all over the place.
And if I remember correctly, the George Reeves movie about George Reeves' life was played by George Reeves was played by Ben Affleck, if I remember correctly.
Oh yeah, that's true. It was actually.
So let's really confuse ourselves.
And so when Abrams' script was ready, Brett Ratner was hired to direct, and Chris Reeve came on as a consultant. And he recommended Smallville star Tom Welling for the lead role.
Right.
But they didn't like that idea, and the Red Cape was ultimately considered by Josh Hartnett, Jude Law, Brendan Fraser, and
all who were more popular at that time.
Than they are now. And as you mentioned earlier, Paul Walker, that was when he was involved at that point. They each declined either because they didn't want to be locked into the multi-film contract.
Paul Walker didn't? How many Fast and Furious?
Well, I don't know. That was just one of the reasons among these guys. Right. There was also a fear about typecasting. Some of them had other projects that they couldn't get locked into a multi-film contract, like I said. And there was also the alleged curse that some people were afraid of. I mean, Ashton Kutcher said that was one of the reasons he turned it down.
I'm glad he didn't get the part.
And Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel star David Boreanaz also passed on the possible job. And, nevertheless, the project moved forward with like a $200 million budget. And they cast such luminaries as Anthony Hopkins and Ralph Fiennes and Christopher Walken for the supporting roles. I mean, can you imagine Walken as Perry White? I really wish
Great Caesar's Ghost.
I mean, I really wish I could do a Walken impression right now. It's it's kind of like William Shatner, but even odder and more awkward. And so more high-profile stars were shuffled through the project, including Marvel stars, eventually Scarlett Johansson and Robert Downey Jr., and, the pirate of all pirates, Johnny Depp.
Arg. In 2004, casting delays helped lead Warner Brothers to fire Ratner and turn down Abrams for the director's chair.
He really wanted to do it.
Yeah, no. Opting instead to bring in Bryan Singer, who abandoned X-Men The Last Stand to take the job, while Ratner took over the X-Men project.
Let's just switch. It's
And ruined X-Men.
Ruined both films.
Yeah, it kind of did a little bit. Singer reconceived the project again, creating Superman Returns, with a storyline about what happens when Superman leaves Earth for 5 years and returns to find Lex Luthor trying to kill billions of people, and Lois Lane with a child and a fiance.
Well, you leave for a minute.
Yeah, no Twitter or Facebook back then. They could have texted.
Yeah, if they could have texted, you imagine.
Hey, guess what? I'm pregnant with your super child. So for the lead role, they cast Brandon Routh, who even Dana Reeve thought had a striking resemblance to Christopher Reeve. And despite several award nominations and some wins, Routh's performance was considered lackluster by several key critics, particularly Gene Siskel. And does he really know? Because
nobody listens to him.
I know. Although I think the storyline was a bit convoluted, it was generally well received, but it did not make as much money as the studio had hoped for.
Yeah,
dollar
whatever.
signs. And its proposed sequel was delayed and delayed until it finally got dropped to, leaving Ralph to move on to other projects, as he is currently appearing as the Atom on the new Legends of Tomorrow television show, which is existing in the same universe as popular programs Arrow and Flash.
Which you love.
Yeah, which were awesome. But, another thing about that is that Ralph did a very good performance in Superman Returns. It was very good homage to the Richard Donner Superman. So it was really a kind of changing of the guard. And I don't think his acting was that bad. I think his acting was it just, people wanted more action. And then you flash forward to what we have now is too much action.
Yeah, Ratner, he was like, well, maybe I should have done, not Ratner.
The other dude.
The other dude. Singer, good Lord. Yeah. Singer was like, well, maybe I did a little too feminine focus on the film. But back on the big screens, things continued to bounce around really unevenly. And a Justice League movie like the Marvel's Avengers was proposed with DJ Catrona contracted as Superman, but that project eventually fizzled out too. And I'm telling you, they really started and stopped like about 650 movies in the last 15 years.
I think it was something to do with kryptonite.
Maybe that's it. And in 2010, Dark Knight series director Christopher Nolan came to the rescue this time, pitching the idea that would eventually become the 2013 release Man of Steel. And for the first time, a non-American was cast in the title role.
Say what?
Yeah, going into another Christopher Reeve lookalike, Henry Cavill, who's from England. And, I guess Chris Reeve really set the standard for Superman for all time. It's always going to be somebody who looks like him, I guess.
Yeah. Man of Steel reboots the Superman saga from the beginning of the origin story covered in Superman the movie, and including the battles with Zod from Superman 2. Other key roles were played by Australian Russell Crowe as Superman's real dad.
It's real international cast.
Yeah, I know. Kevin Costner as Kevin Costner. I mean, because he's the same in every movie.
Kevin Costner plays the same guy.
I did enjoy him as Pa Kent. And Diane Lane was Mama Kent there, his adoptive parents. Amy Adams played Lois Lane, and Lawrence Fishburne as Perry White, which I thought was very good casting, and nobody seemed to care about that.
Nobody cared about his race.
He's like red pill or blue pill, Neo.
Different film.
A different film altogether. While Superman Returns was considered a bit too soft and too orientated towards a female audience, some found Man of Steel a bit too brooding with over-the-top action. Superman's darker costume was also a concern for some fanboys, but it was exceedingly well received, grossing $668 million with its biggest foreign reception in China. As we have said, China is a very important emerging market for cinema. And particularly action films, and producers are going to be paying a lot of more attention to when they develop new projects. So don't expect any Chinese villains anytime soon.
I think we're going to have to start seeing some Chinese leading men and women in some of these films.
Man of Steel was also the first feature film to be released simultaneously on regular screens and in the IMAX format.
In fact, they had some scenes that they shot that they had hoped to put on the DVD bonuses, but it was in IMAX, and it had been converted and they couldn't use it. So that was a lot of money down the drain for that. But the film also provides the background for the new Batman vs. Superman, as we can tell from all of the new film's previews, and the mindless destruction of Smallville, in particular Metropolis, and the battle between Superman and Zod seems to be what has caused Batman to so dislike Superman. And
only if Batman was an insurance salesman, I don't know if he'd agree.
Yeah, maybe that's it. They blew up his buildings, right? That's the real issue.
Yeah.
Not in my house.
Not in my house.
While some of the casting decisions have been questioned, including 42-year-old Ben Affleck as Batman. He's going to walk with a cane, says I, who's older than that.
Or Batfleck.
Yeah, as we've joked, and then Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman, but a Wonder Woman without that buxom wholesomeness of Linda Carter.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see, I think, what Jesse Eisenberg does with the iconic role of Lex Luthor. Especially,
it's going to be a different portrayal.
Yeah, I mean, he's so much younger than predecessors like Gene Hackman and Kevin Spacey, and I think casting him in that role really looks like what they've been doing with the villains on the DC television shows like Gotham, focusing a bit more on their origin. So I think that's the direction they're going, so we'll see.
Well, later this week on our blog, we will discuss more about the Superman television shows, including my favorite Smallville, Lois and Clark, plus the great animated DVD shorts and movies. Next week's episode, we're going to examine the history of Batman on film with a spoiler-free review.
No. Isn't that it? No.
Yeah, Batman. For Batman versus Superman.
That really super cheesy series.
Yeah, we don't own the rights to that song. But then in 2 weeks, we'll conclude our 3-part Justice League series with an exploration of Wonder Woman's screen background, and there's lots to look forward to. So here's to truth, justice, and all that other stuff.
Wow, really?
Henry Cavill's a Brit, so I guess we can't say the American way. Truth, justice, and God save the Queen. And all that other stuff. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Geek Homeworld podcast with your host, SavageTechman. You can find us on Libsyn, Google+, follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, listen to us on iTunes, see us on YouTube, be part of our Mixler chats. Thank you. See you again on the Geek Homeworld podcast.